Prologue. No one knows exactly how many secrets the caves of Appalachia hide. These dark and damp dungeons stretch for hundreds of kilometers, their labyrinths seemingly designed to lead people astray. There are legends among the locals that some of the caves are cursed. Those who go too deep into them never return. Jacob Stanton was an amateur geologist and had long wanted to explore an old cave called Shadow Gate. This cave was known for its strange and unexplained phenomena. According to stories, whisper-like voices were heard inside, even when one was completely alone. Others claimed to have seen strange silhouettes in the depths that seemed to move on their own. Despite the warnings, Jacob decided to go into the cave. 3 friends agreed to go with him: Liz, Chris, and Mark. They were experienced hikers and thought they could handle any difficulty. None of them believed in mysticism, writing off all the rumors to the imagination and psyche of people trapped in a confined space. At dawn, they gathered at the entrance to the Shadow Gate. The cave looked grim. Its entrance was like a black maw, shrouded in the thick shadows of the trees. Jacob pulled out a map he'd found at the local library. It was a copy of an ancient drawing made by an unknown explorer in the 19th century. The map looked incomplete, but Jacob was sure it would be part of their adventure. "Ready?" he asked. Liz hummed. "Ready, but it's going to be creepy. I hope you're sure we won't get lost." Chris laughed. "If we do, we'll pick ourselves up by the crumbs like Hansel and Gretel." Mark, usually a bit terse, just nodded and they went inside. Darkness enveloped them like a thick blanket. The lanterns illuminated the damp stone walls, which smelled damp and cold. For the first few hours of the journey, there was no sign of trouble. They found old markings on the walls, signs Jacob thought explorers had left decades ago. With each step, however, their surroundings grew more ominous. Part 1: Whispers in the Dark. They moved further and further away, leaving behind the light that poured from the narrow entrance. The silence around them seemed almost deafening. No sound of water, no rustling of the small inhabitants of the cave. Only their footsteps and muffled echoes accompanied the group. It had been about 2 hours. They followed Jacob's map, marking turns and making notes on the walls so they wouldn't lose their way. Soon, however, they came across the first strange sign: a narrow tunnel that wasn't on the map. "What do you think? Shall we go take a look?" Jacob suggested, peering through the narrow gap. The light of the flashlight was lost somewhere ahead, as if the tunnel went far into the depths. "We'd better stay on the path," Mark muttered, but his voice didn't sound confident. "Come on, it's an adventure." Liz had always been a risk-taker. Without waiting for the others to decide, she pointed the flashlight into the tunnel and took a step forward. "Liz, wait!" Jacob called out to her, but it was too late. She disappeared around the corner. A second later, her voice came back. "There's something strange here. You have to see it." The others looked at each other and followed her, reluctantly agreeing. The tunnel was narrower than the main passage and gradually narrowed. The travelers had to move more slowly, sometimes bending down to pass further. There was a faint odor of something ancient and decaying in the air, as if the tunnel held the remains of long-forgotten secrets. After about 15 minutes, they emerged into a small chamber. The walls were modeled with strange designs, some sort of symbols that didn't look like the language they were familiar with. "What the hell is this? Who drew this?" Chris whispered, running his hand along the wall. "I don't know. It looks like some ancient writing. Indians, maybe?" Jacob examined the symbols with interest, snapping pictures with his camera. Suddenly, Mark tensed up. "Do you hear that?" The others froze. A strange sound was heard in the distance. It was a whisper, barely audible but distinct. It didn't sound like an echo of their voices. It sounded closer, as if it was coming from the cave itself. "Hey, who's there?" Liz asked loudly, aiming the flashlight beam into the void. The whispering subsided for a moment, then resumed, now closer. Liz took a step back. "It's the wind, I guess," Chris muttered, but there was no certainty in his voice. "There's no wind here," Jacob replied quietly, looking out into the darkness. They decided not to linger in this cell, but as soon as the group moved back, Liz was gone again. "Liz!" Jacob shouted. Chris looked up at the wall and saw that her backpack was still there, but the girl herself was gone. The backpack looked like she had just dropped it and disappeared. "This isn't funny anymore," Mark said hoarsely. Jacob stepped closer and saw footprints on the ground leading to another narrow passage they hadn't noticed before. "We can't leave her," he said, peering into the passage. "Are you out of your mind? We don't even know what's in there." Chris was startled. "I know she's in there, though. I'll go," Jacob replied, turning on the second flashlight. He stepped into the passage and the others were forced to follow him. The passage was even narrower than the first. The light from the lanterns seemed fainter, and the whispering grew louder. It now sounded like a multitude of voices overlapping each other. In a few minutes, they found themselves in yet another hall. Here the walls were smooth, as if polished. In the center lay a circular slab covered with the same symbols they had seen earlier. "Where's Liz?" Mark asked tensely, and then they heard her voice. She was calling out to them, but the sound came from seemingly everywhere. "Help!" Liz's voice shook, as if she was terrified. "She's here!" Jacob exclaimed, rushing to the stove. He tried to move it, thinking there might be a passage underneath. But as soon as he touched the slab, the light from the lanterns began to fade. Darkness fell over them like a thick blanket. Whispers now sounded right beside them, but no one could make out the words. "Don't move!" Mark hissed, his voice trembling. "Something's coming." Strange footsteps sounded out of the darkness. The sound was heavy and wet, like something huge and alive was coming toward them. Suddenly Liz's voice came again, but now it sounded very different. Low, stretched out, as if she was being called from another reality. "Come to me." Part 2. Darkness takes shape. The footsteps came closer and closer. Jacob frantically pointed the flashlight toward the sound, but the beam of light illuminated nothing, as if the darkness around him was alive and consuming him. "We can't stay here," Chris whispered, grabbing onto Jacob. "But Liz is in there," he replied, trying not to give in to panic. "It's not Liz anymore," Mark said firmly. His face was tense and his eyes read fear bordering on despair. At that moment, the darkness began to move. It seemed to thicken, taking shape. A silhouette appeared before them, tall, distorted, with long limbs that resembled not arms but wriggling tentacles. "What is that?" Chris shrieked, but was immediately silenced as the figure began to move towards them. The voices that had previously sounded like whispers turned into an eerie chorus. They were screams, moans, cries. All sounds merged into one eerie melody. "Run!" Mark shouted, grabbing Jacob's arm. They raced back, trying to find the way they had come. But it was as if the cave had changed. Their markings on the walls were gone, the tunnels more confusing. Each step became more and more difficult. The air around them became thick and heavy, as if an invisible force was pulling them backward. "Jacob, the map!" Chris shouted. Jacob stopped, fumbled in his pocket, and unfolded the map. But it no longer made sense. The lines he'd drawn were now chaotically intertwined, as if someone had deliberately distorted it. "It's impossible," he whispered. There was a low rumble from behind, as if the cave itself was making a sound. It was like the roar of a huge beast, but no beast could be that huge. They stopped at yet another chamber, trying to catch their breath. Mark turned around and pointed the flashlight at the passage they had come from. Nothing could be seen but utter darkness. "We're not getting out of here," he whispered. "Don't say that," Jacob snarled. "We'll find a way out." Just then Liz's voice came again. "Why did you leave? Help me." Chris covered his ears with his hands. "It's not her. It's not her." But Jacob, despite his fear, took a step toward the passageway. "Liz, where are you?" His voice shook, but he kept walking forward. Mark tried to stop him. "Don't you dare. She's dead, or it's something else. If you go that way, we'll lose you too." But Jacob wasn't listening. As he stepped out into the next tunnel, he saw Liz. She was standing in the distance, her back to him. Her hair was disheveled and her clothes were torn, but she seemed unharmed. "Liz!" he shouted and rushed to her. She didn't move, but as he got closer, her head began to slowly turn. The face was not hers. It was alien, distorted, with empty eye sockets and a dead smile. Jacob froze, his feet feeling as if they were stuck to the ground. "You came for me?" Her voice rang out, but it sounded like it was coming from all the walls of the cave at once. Suddenly, Liz blurred, her body seeming to melt into thin air. In its place was darkness, which immediately began to take the form of the very creature they had seen earlier. The creature moved towards him, extending its long limbs. Mark and Chris, hearing Jacob's screams, rushed toward it. They saw the darkness literally consuming him. Jacob tried to break free, but in vain. His scream was cut off abruptly, leaving only dead silence behind him. "We can't save him," Mark shouted, grabbing Chris's arm. "We have to get out." They ran back, but it was as if the cave was alive now. The tunnels narrowed, blocking their way. Shadows reached out from the walls, grabbing at their clothes. Chris stumbled and fell. Mark turned around, trying to help him, but a tentacle-like shadow suddenly burst out of the darkness, wrapping around Chris. His face contorted in horror as the darkness dragged him down into the depths. Now only Mark was left. Mark ran without looking back. His flashlight flickered, but he didn't dare stop. He screamed for help, but realized that no one would hear him. Suddenly he saw a light. It was the way out. It was so close. Mark rushed forward with all his might. But when he ran outside, everything around him was not the same. The forest that surrounded the entrance to the cave was gone. In its place was a strange, dead landscape with a red sky and black, scorched trees. Behind him came the same low roar. He turned around and saw darkness like a living creature bursting out of the cave. Mark realized he had become a part of this cursed place. A few weeks later, locals found Jacob's backpack at the entrance to the Shadow Gate, but none of the group was ever found. Since then, no one else has ventured into that cave. But sometimes at night, there are whispers and strange rumblings that sound like cries for help. Part 3: Aftermath and New Mysteries. 3 months have passed since Jacob's group disappeared. The locals had avoided the Shadow Gate, but rumors of the missing hikers had spread far beyond the region. This attracted the attention of researchers and journalists who were eager to solve the mystery of the disappearance. Among them was Edward Grayson, a writer and hunter of mystical stories. He specialized in researching anomalous areas and was convinced that there was more to this cave than just a tragic accident. Edward arrived in the village near the cave with a team of 3 people: Anna, an experienced speleologist; Victor, a mapping specialist; and Lewis, a technician responsible for the equipment. From the beginning, the locals refused to help them. The village elder, an elderly man with a hard stare, met Edward with undisguised hostility. "You don't realize what you're getting into," he said. "Those who go too deep don't come back. This place has taken a lot of people. You'd better leave before it's too late." But Edward was adamant. He argued that he was better prepared than anyone else and that modern equipment would help avoid tragedy. Victor, studying an old map of the cave, noticed strange inconsistencies. Some parts of the map Jacob had made didn't match the official data. "It's like the cave is alive," he muttered, but quickly pushed the thought away. The next day, the group entered the cave. They had state-of-the-art equipment: drones to explore the narrow passages, satellite navigators, and sensors to detect movement and sounds. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. They marked the path, set up beacons, and scanned the space. But as soon as they reached the chamber with the ancient symbols, the sensors began to malfunction. "Is this normal?" Anna asked, watching the indicators on Lewis's screen flash erratically. "No," Lewis frowned. "They're showing strange electromagnetic interference. That happens near strong power sources, but there shouldn't be anything like that here." Edward examined the symbols on the walls. They looked older than he'd expected. Their shapes resembled ancient petroglyphs, but were strangely distorted, as if the creators were trying to convey something beyond human comprehension. "Something's not right here," he said quietly. As the group was about to move on, there was another whisper in the cave. This time it was louder and more distinct. "Can you hear it?" Anna asked, straining her hearing. Everyone froze. The whisper sounded as if it came from all directions, resembling the voices of many people speaking at once. "It can't be an echo," Victor said quietly. Louis activated the audio recording and began to analyze the sounds. After a few minutes, his face turned pale. "They're voices. Several different voices. They're speaking in an unfamiliar language." "Are you sure?" Edward stepped closer. Louis nodded, showing a graph of the sound frequency. "These aren't random noises. It's speech." Despite the alarm, the group decided to continue on their way. They found a narrow passage that wasn't marked on the maps. Edward insisted on exploring it. The passage led into a larger chamber. Here the walls were smooth, as if carved by hand. On the floor was the round slab Jacob had mentioned in his notes. Edward examined it and noticed that it was covered in the same symbols as the walls. But as soon as he touched the slab, the cave seemed to come alive. A low rumble rang through the walls and the whispering intensified. The light of the lanterns began to fade, and shadows began to flicker around them. "We have to go," Anna shouted, grabbing Edward's arm. But it was too late. The shadows began to thicken, taking on human shapes. They were blurry, twisted figures like the ones they'd seen on the wall paintings. One of the figures spoke, her voice deep and shrill at the same time. "You shouldn't be here." Edward tried to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. The figures began to approach, surrounding them. Louis, unable to stand, rushed to escape, but as soon as he crossed the boundary of the room, the shadows pounced on him. His scream echoed through the cave, but after a second it was silent. "What do they want?" Anna screamed, pressing herself into the wall. The figure slowly raised its hand, pointing to the slab. Edward realized the cave was protecting its secret. Victor tried to smash the slab with his hammer, but as soon as the blow reached its surface, the cave began to cave in. Rocks sprinkled from above, and the passage through which they had come was blocked. "We're going to be buried here," Anna screamed. "No," Edward said firmly. "I'll stay." He walked toward the slab, feeling it was the only way out. The figure stopped, watching him. Edward knelt down and placed his hands on the slab. Voices began to sound in his head, whispered at first, then louder and louder. He saw images, past explorers who had gone missing, an ancient ritual sealed in the depths of the cave, and a creature whose power guarded the place. "You want the truth?" he uttered aloud. The shadows dissolved and the chamber fell into silence. A few days later, a rescue team found the cave's entrance blocked. They found only Victor and Anna, unconscious but alive. When asked what happened, both refused to speak, only repeating, "This is not a place for people." Edward was never found, but his notes, left at the entrance to the cave, contained one phrase: "Truth is a curse, and it lies in the depths." The locals permanently closed the cave, blocking the entrance with stones. But those who passed by claimed to occasionally hear a quiet whisper from beneath the ground. Part 4. The Legacy of the Shadow Gate. It had been years since the Shadow Gate cave had been sealed. The locals had stopped mentioning it in conversation, and any attempts by outside explorers to make their way to the place had been thwarted. However, the mystery of the disappearance of Edward Grayson and his crew continued to beckon to lovers of mystery and mysticism. One foggy evening, a man who identified himself as Alexander Rivers, a writer and historian, appeared in the village. He was passionate about exploring sites associated with ancient cults and lost civilizations. Alexander claimed to have found Grayson's writings, which described the cave's connection to ancient myths of beings living beyond the world. The locals greeted him with the same hostility as other outsiders. Alexander, however, was not about to back down. He found Anna, the only survivor who, after all these years, still lived in the same village but avoided any talk of the events in the cave. At first, Anna flatly refused to communicate, but Alexander was persistent. He knew that her memory held a clue. After a few days, the woman gave in, but her story was curt, as if she was afraid to evoke what was left in the cave. "We went there because of Edward. He thought he would find the truth, but he found something else entirely," she said, looking down at the floor. When Alexander asked her about the shadows, Anna turned pale. "They weren't just shadows, they were alive. They knew everything about us. They reached into our minds, pulling out our darkest fears. And Edward, he learned something that made him decide to stay there. I don't want to remember." Alexander left her alone, but his determination to explore the cave only grew stronger. At dawn, Alexander set off toward the rubble-strewn cave. Locals tried to stop him, but he was adamant. Taking his equipment and Grayson's journals with him, he began raking through the rubble. A few hours later, the passage was open. The cave greeted him with cold and ominous silence. Turning on his flashlight, Alexander took the first step inside. As with previous explorers, at first everything seemed ordinary. Tunnels, chambers, walls mottled with strange symbols. But the deeper he went, the more he felt that he was being watched. On one wall, he found what he was looking for. Additional notes from Grayson, scrawled on a sharp stone. "Truth lies in the center. The slab is the door. But not every door needs to be opened." Alexander moved on, despite the rumbling echo that now sounded closer and closer. He knew that the slab was connected to a cult mentioned in the ancient texts. This cult worshipped a being that dwelt between worlds, that they called the Guardian of the Edge. As Alexander reached the slab, he felt the air around him seem to freeze. He studied the symbols, taking pictures of them, trying to understand their meaning. At one point, his fingers accidentally slipped over a depression in the center of the stove. It glowed with a dim bluish light, and the cave filled with a hum. The whispering that the previous explorers had heard had returned, but now it sounded clearer. Alexander discerned the phrases, "Your sacrifice will be accepted." The shadows began to thicken around him. Their movements were chaotic, as if they were arguing among themselves. Alexander felt the ground beneath the slab begin to tremble. The slab slowly rose, revealing a narrow passage. Without hesitation, he climbed down. There he found a huge hall, the walls of which shone with a soft blue light. In the center of the hall hovered a sphere shrouded in haze. As Alexander stepped closer, a voice, deep and ancient, sounded in his mind. "You have come to learn, but learning has its price." He realized it was the Guardian of the Fringe. The voice offered Alexander a choice. "You can leave, but you will be left empty-handed. Or you can learn the secret, but become part of it." Alexander thought for only a moment. His obsession with the truth outweighed his fear. "I want to know," he replied. The sphere flashed with blinding light, and images flashed through Alexander's mind. He saw the beginning of time, the creation of worlds, and how beings like the Guardian existed outside the boundaries of reality. But with that knowledge came pain. He felt his body begin to dissolve. "You have chosen. You will now be my eyes in this world," the voice said. Alexander never returned from the cave, but soon the locals began to notice strange phenomena. At night, a faint blue glow sometimes emanated from the cave, and whispers began to be heard even by those far from the entrance. Mysterious books, whose author signed himself as the Eye of the Guardian, began to appear in cities across the country. These texts contained descriptions of ancient knowledge that overturned perceptions of reality. People who read them claimed to hear whispers, and some disappeared without a trace. The Shadow Gates became more than just a cave. They became a symbol, a point where reality intersects with the unknown. Part 5. Spreading the Curse. The Guardian's Eyes books began to spread rapidly around the world. They appeared in library archives, antique stores, sometimes even in random boxes at sales. No one knew where they came from, but each one contained unusually accurate information about ancient civilizations, cosmic phenomena, and forgotten rituals. Those who read these books experienced strange side effects. They began to have nightmares in which shadows of distorted beings called their names. Some were haunted by strange coincidences, and some began to disappear under mysterious circumstances. Rumors of the books attracted the attention of both government organizations and various occult groups. The former sought to destroy them, the latter to use them. Soon a group called itself the Light of the Fringe emerged. Its leaders claimed that the books were not just a source of knowledge, but the key to a new stage of human development. The Guardian offers us the opportunity to touch the truth, they said in their secret meetings. But truth is only available to those who are willing to give up everything for it. The order attracted thousands of followers around the world. Their rituals became increasingly bizarre and macabre. Groups of adepts gathered in secluded places to perform rituals that repeated ancient symbols found in the cave. But with each ritual performed, inexplicable phenomena began to occur. Flashes of light in the sky, disappearance of entire villages, and in some cases, the appearance of strange figures resembling shadows from the cave. Investigation of the TRC agency. Major governments created a secret agency known as TRK, Mystery and Reality of the Cosmos, to investigate the books and prevent them from affecting society. The agency found that books contained not just information, but also a kind of code that influenced the mind. Their content seemed to implant images and sounds into the reader's brain that could not be forgotten. One of the agents, Joan Carter, who specialized in the study of occult artifacts, decided to go to the village where it all began. Joan arrived in the village disguised as a journalist. He managed to find an elder who reluctantly agreed to tell the truth about the cave. "Do you think it's just books?" the old man asked. "No, they are seeds. They germinate in the souls of those who read them. The Guardian wants more. He wants to come out of the shadows." Joan insisted on getting to the cave, but the elder warned, "If you go in, you will never come back the same." The guide who accompanied Joan refused to go inside and left him alone at the entrance. When Joan entered the cave, he felt the air was thickened. His lantern flickered and the shadows on the walls seemed too alive. When he reached the hall with the slab, he found something new. The symbols on the walls glowed with a faint blue light, and above the slab hovered a small sphere similar to the one Alexander had seen. A voice sounded out of the blue. "Have you come to find out how to stop me?" Joan realized he was talking to the Guardian. His voice wasn't just a sound. It was as if it penetrated the mind, making him feel small and insignificant. "I've come to understand what you want," Joan replied, trying not to show fear. "I want more. Your world is just a boundary. I want to go beyond it, and your souls are the doors." Joan tried to find out how to stop the Guardian's influence from spreading, but the Guardian only laughed. "You can't stop the flow when the dam is already broken. The truth has been set free." For a moment, Joan saw images, millions of shadows that moved through reality, conquering world after world. They were the Guardian's servants, and he realized there was no stopping their approach. But he noticed one detail. The symbols on the walls weren't just decoration. They were part of a sealing ritual. If you understood how they worked, you could close the gate again. Joan left the cave alive, but shaken. He had brought the drawings of the symbols with him, hoping the TRC scientists could decipher them. But now he was hearing the whispers himself. Shadows began to appear in his dreams, and at night he could feel himself being watched. Despite this, he was certain of one thing. Humanity still had a chance to stop the Guardian. But that chance required sacrifice. Preparing for the final ritual, the TRKs began a massive study of the symbols. Scientists and occultists came to the conclusion that they could be used to create a barrier that would prevent the Guardian from entering our world. But this required contact with the creature itself. Someone had to enter the cave and perform the ritual from within. Joan volunteered. He knew this would be his last mission. Part 6. Last Chance. The TRC have been preparing for the ritual for a long time. Specialists from all over the world collected ancient texts, remnants of Grayson's diaries and Alexander Rivers' notes. Every word was analyzed and checked against the symbols Joan had brought. The plan was simple. Joan was to penetrate the depths of the cave, find the slab, and complete a ritual that began centuries ago. This ritual would seal the gate between our world and the reality of the Guardian. But even the best scientists could not have predicted the cost this would bring. On the day of the mission, Joan left the TRK camp near the village. He was accompanied by 3 men: Dr. Mary Grace, a leading expert on occult texts; Thomas Brain, the engineer in charge of installing the equipment; and Eric Sloan, a guard armed with experimental shadow fighting devices. As they approached the cave entrance, the air seemed colder than usual. Joan sensed something invisible watching them. "Are we ready?" he asked, looking around at his companions. Mary nodded, holding up the symbol book. "The ritual is complete if we follow the exact instructions." The cave greeted them with the same eerie silence that had driven the previous explorers mad. The lanterns created long shadows and seemed to move. From the beginning, the team noticed the oddities. The sensors Thomas had installed at the entrance showed sharp bursts of electromagnetic waves. The echo of footsteps sounded unnaturally loud, as if the walls of the cave were returning distorted sound to them. "This place isn't just a cave," Thomas said, checking the scope. "It's like it's alive." The deeper they went, the heavier they felt. The air became thick, as if saturated with something alien. When the group reached the chamber with the slab, the light from the lanterns began to flicker. The symbols on the walls glowed with a faint blue light, just as they had when Alexander had been here. "That's her," Mary said quietly. Joan walked over to the stove. He knew that once the ritual began, things might not go according to plan. "We're ready," he said, unfolding the sheets with the text of the ritual. Mary began to read the ancient words carved into the walls. Her voice trembled, but with each word spoken, the shiver in the air grew stronger. As soon as the ritual began, the shadows in the cave came to life. They slipped out of corners, transforming into distorted figures. "Thomas, activate the equipment," shouted Joan. Thomas turned on the light generators, which created intense flashes, scaring away the shadows. Eric, with his gun drawn, fired at the densest of them, but they were moving too fast. "That'll hold them off for a while," he shouted. "They're getting stronger." As Mary spoke the last word of the text, the cave filled with a deafening rumble. A slab rose up, opening a portal to another reality. A figure slowly began to emerge from the portal, huge, blurred, and disproportionate to human perception. It was the Guardian. "You won't be able to stop me." The voice resounded simultaneously in the cave and in the minds of every member of the team. "We're here to seal you forever," shouted Joan. The Guardian answered, and his voice grew louder, filling minds with visions of endless worlds and destruction. Some of these visions were so horrific that Thomas fainted. Joan realized that the ritual would not be complete without a sacrifice. He picked up the device the scientists had prepared and activated it. It was an energy capacitor that was supposed to create a barrier, but required a huge source of energy, the energy of a human soul. "This is the end for me," he said, looking at Mary. "Joan, no. We can find another way," she exclaimed. "There is no time. Tell the world that truth can be destructive. That is my choice." He stood on the slab, holding the device in his hands. Shadows began to swirl around him, trying to interfere. Joan shouted the words the Guardian had prompted him in the visions. The words were not part of the ritual, but he knew they would complete the process. The light from the device flared and the portal began to tighten. The shadows disappeared one by one, and the Guardian's voice fell silent. When it was over, the cave was once again filled with silence. Mary and Eric made their way outside. They knew that Joan had sacrificed himself to close the shadow gate. After these events, the cave was finally sealed under the control of the TRC. Mary began writing a book in which she warned humanity against the pursuit of limitless knowledge. But even after the cave was closed, people sometimes heard whispers coming from underground. And those who had once touched the truth knew that the Guardian had not disappeared. He's just waiting for his time. Part 7: Joan's Legacy. It had been 10 years since the cave had been sealed. The TRKs were careful to make sure no one went near the place. The village nearby was deserted. The inhabitants had left for fear of a resurgence of evil. But the world was no more peaceful. The books, Eyes of the Guardian, continued to appear in different corners of the planet. Their content became more and more dark, and their impact on people more dangerous. Mary Grace, who had become a central figure in the fight against the Guardian, began to notice strange things. Her dreams were filled with visions of a cave, a stove, and Joan's voice calling her to return. In one of her nightmares, Mary heard Joan's words, "You think I saved you all, but it was only a reprieve. They're still here, and I became a part of them." She woke up in a cold sweat and realized it wasn't just a dream. Joan had tried to warn her. Mary turned to the TRC archives to see if anything unusual had happened around the cave. The data showed a spike in electromagnetic activity in the area. And then she learned of several disappearances of tourists who had found themselves in the vicinity of the sealed Shadow Gate despite prohibitions. One morning, Mary received a package with no return address. Inside was a book signed, "The Eye of the Guardian." On the first page was a text she knew by heart. It was the last ritual Joan had performed. But there were new symbols in the book that she hadn't seen before. They were chaotic, as if they were tearing order from within. "This is impossible," she whispered. It was as if the symbols were talking to her, awakening memories inside of her of what had happened in the cave. Mary realized she had to go back to where it all began. She gathered a new group, Daniel Hunt, a young cryptographer who studied ancient languages, Clara Watson, a biologist specializing in anomalous phenomena, Richard Blake, a military man with experience in covert operations. They had been warned of the possible risks, but each realized that this was a mission of great importance. When the group reached the village, they found it completely abandoned. All the houses stood empty, but the air was saturated with the feeling that someone was watching. "Can you feel it?" Daniel asked, looking around. "Yes," Clara replied. "It's like shadows are moving behind us." They approached the sealed cave. The entrance was blocked by mountains of rock, but ancient symbols on the rocks shone with a faint light that hadn't been there before. Using the ancient texts and knowledge left behind by Joan, Mary and her team began to excavate. Each step was accompanied by whispers that grew louder. As they removed the last stones, opening up the passage, the whispering turned into a thunderous roar. "We're not alone here," Richard said, holding his weapon at the ready. As soon as they entered the cave, it was clear that its interior landscape had changed. The walls glowed and the shadows on the floor moved despite the absence of a light source. Mary felt Joan's voice fill her mind again. "Mary, they tricked us. The ritual was a trap. They're not sealed. They're here." Shadows began to thicken around the team, morphing into something more. "We have to get to the stove," she shouted. The path to the slab was more difficult than they had anticipated. The shadows were becoming more aggressive, their touches burning and their whispers trying to get into every member of the group's mind. Richard was shooting back, covering the others. Daniel was trying to decipher the symbols to find a way to lessen the shadows' influence. "Mary, there's something new here," he said, pointing to the walls. "These symbols say that the Guardian is using our souls as anchors to get out." When the group reached the slab, it was clear that repeating the ritual wouldn't be able to stop the Guardian. He required a new sacrifice, but this time a conscious and willing one. "I have to stay," Mary said. "No!" Daniel exclaimed. "We'll find another way. This is the only way. If I give myself, I can hold him off for thousands more years. It's my responsibility." Mary began the ritual. The shadows tried to interfere with her, but the light coming from the stove weakened them. As she said the last words, her body began to dissolve into a blue glow. She felt her consciousness merging with something infinite, becoming part of the barrier between worlds. Richard and Daniel made their way outside, watching as the cave entrance finally collapsed. "She did it," Daniel said. "But how long will this sacrifice last?" There was no answer. Clara, who had remained outside the village, met them with words. "We have bought time, but the Guardian will return. And when he does, we must be ready." The TRKs began a new era of preparation, hoping that humanity could deal with the threat that still lurked in the shadows. Part 8. Echoes of the Guardian. Another 5 years had passed since Mary Grace's sacrifice. The world seemed to have regained its equilibrium, But deep in the laboratories of the TRC, in the secret archives and the minds of the researchers, fear persisted. They knew that the Guardian's influence could not be completely eradicated. Mary's disappearance spawned legends among the surviving members of the team. It became a personal duty for Daniel and Richard to uncover the truth about the Guardian and find a way to stop him for good. The TRKs began a project called Echoes to investigate the remaining books and any manifestations of shadows in different parts of the world. One night, the TRK lab received a strange signal that was picked up by their network of satellites. Its source was in the area where the cave used to be located. Daniel, now head of the cryptographic analysis department, was the first to decipher the signal. It was a voice, Mary's voice. "Don't try to stop him here. This is a trap. Look for the answer in the place where humanity began." "What does that mean?" Richard asked, to whom Daniel immediately handed the tape. "I don't know," he replied. "But if she's right, we're looking in the wrong direction." The TRC did extensive research. Using key words from Mary's message, they turned their attention to the region of East Africa called the Cradle of Humankind. Archaeological evidence pointed to ancient civilizations that had vanished without a trace but left behind strange artifacts. A team of researchers was sent to Ethiopia, to the region of the Afar Mountains, where the oldest traces of ancient people were located. Daniel and Richard once again found themselves together in the field. With them went Dr. Eliza Croft, an expert on ancient cultures, and engineer Luke Hunter, who was developing equipment to study anomalies. The team discovered an underground cave system in the Afar Triangle that had not previously been explored. Carved into the walls were symbols similar to those found in the Guardian's cave, but they looked older. "This is older than anything we've seen," Eliza said as she studied the inscriptions. Among the symbols they found an image, a circle with eyes surrounded by human figures. It was the Guardian, but depicted not as a deity, but as a prisoner. "I think it used to be locked in here," Daniel said. As the group explored the caves, they found a small altar with manuscripts made of an unknown material. They were only partially deciphered, but the text spoke. "He was not a god. He was an alien captured by us. We used his power to create life, but he gained his freedom and destroyed us." "Are you saying that the Guardian isn't a supernatural being, but technology?" asked Luke. "More like a mixture of science and mysticism," Elise replied. "He was someone who changed the course of our evolution, but not by his own will." As soon as they reached the depths of the cave, the shadows began to reappear. They were fainter than they had been in the Guardian's cave, but their presence was a clear signal. The Guardian already knew of their whereabouts. "We're not alone," Richard said, holding his weapon at the ready. The group sped up their work. On the altar, they found a crystalline object that exuded a faint glow. "It could be his anchor," Daniel said. They were faced with a choice. They could destroy the crystal, which would probably weaken the Guardian's influence, or they could try to use it to study it and find a better way to destroy the threat. "If we destroy it, we rob ourselves of the chance to figure out how to stop it permanently," Luke said. "But if we leave it behind, it might find a way to use it against us," Richard objected. After much debate, they decided to keep the crystal and bring it to the TRK lab for study. As they left the cave, the group again encountered shadows that were becoming more aggressive. They managed to get out only thanks to Luke's ingenuity, who adjusted the equipment to create a flash of light that scared the creatures away. Back at the base, Daniel and Eliza began studying the crystal. They found strange patterns in its structure that could have been part of a language or code. A few weeks after their return, strange events began to happen. Those who had been working with the crystal began to have dreams in which the Guardian spoke to them. "You think you control me? But I'm already here." The crystal proved to be not only a key, but also a trap. Part 9, the mind trap. Research into the crystal had exacerbated increasingly strange and frightening phenomena. People who came in contact with it began losing consciousness for hours and then waking up with blank eyes, as if their minds had been taken away by someone or something. Daniel and Eliza spent days studying its structure, but they couldn't find a logical explanation for what was happening. The symbols within the crystal didn't just resonate with what they had already seen. but seemed to be changing. Each touch of the object brought about changes that led to even more powerful mental impulses. Many of those who worked with the crystal began to hear a voice, a whisper that seemed to come from their own minds, but was simultaneously alien. The shadows in the lab grew denser and denser, and sometimes they seemed to follow people without disappearing as before. One of the first to suffer was Luke. He began to suffer from bouts of insanity, his perception of reality distorted. One night, when Eliza came to check on him, she found him sitting in a dark room with empty eyes, as if he were in another world. He didn't hear her, didn't respond to her words. "He's become part of this place," Eliza whispered. Daniel, on the other hand, despite his stamina, began to experience symptoms. He could feel his consciousness slowly losing touch with reality. At night, he heard a voice that increasingly addressed him. "You are searching for an answer, but you already know that I am with you, in your mind." Months went by and more of the people working with the crystal became mentally unstable. The TRKs were beginning to lose control of the situation, and the Guardian's influence over their work was becoming apparent. Eliza decided that it was necessary to seek help from old colleagues, those who had once studied the ancient texts and archaeology of these mysterious places. One such scholar, Professor James Ford, specialized in the study of ancient technologies that combined elements of magic and science. He was the only one who could help decipher the true meaning of the symbols on the crystal. When Eliza and Daniel brought the crystal to Ford's lab, he immediately sensed that it wasn't just an artifact. It was the key to something far greater than they could have imagined. The professor studied the crystal for weeks and finally unlocked the mystery of its design. He stated that it wasn't just a stone. It was a device created by ancient civilizations to hold an essence called the eye. The Guardian was not the only one to fall into this trap. He was only the first to be able to break its shell and get out. The eye is an ancient entity encased in the void, existing between worlds, Ford said, filling the space of the room with his grim voice. Its purpose is to destroy the worlds it visits and absorb their energy. It's not just a consciousness, he added. It's a mind that can manipulate reality. It uses people as vessels for its existence, and the more it manipulates them, the more powerful it becomes. Eliza and Daniel realized that they had to find a way to destroy the eye before it consumed not only them, but the entire world. Ford suggested a dangerous path. They had to return to the cave where it all began and activate the device that had been installed to imprison the Guardian in an infinite cyclic state. But to do this, they had to use not the crystal, but a special device that had been preserved in the cave. "We have to put him back where he was incarcerated," said Ford. "Only there can we destroy it forever." The group returned to the cave, but this time they were accompanied by others who were willing to take the risk to save humanity. Eliza, Daniel, Ford, and a few other specialists began searching for the device. The cave was not as they remembered it before. The shadows were active again and the air felt heavy. The farther they moved, the more they sensed that the Guardian was watching them, ready to interfere with their plans. "You won't bring me back," Daniel heard the Guardian's voice in his mind. "I know you. I have become a part of you." When they finally reached the spot where the slab had previously stood, they found that it was gone. In its place was a gaping rift from which a stream of energy burst forth. It wasn't just a portal, it was the gateway through which the Guardian was returning to the world. "This is the final test," Ford said. "If we can't get him back here, he'll destroy everything." Eliza and Daniel realized that the only way to stop him was sacrifice. But one of them had to enter the gate and seal it forever. After much thought, Eliza decided that she had to be the one to stay. She knew that only her sacrifice would be able to seal the Guardian again. Before she stepped through the gate, she handed Daniel one last note that said, "Don't forget, the force behind all this is not just evil. It is something much older and more powerful. We have become part of its history, and its story will not end with us." As Eliza disappeared into the gate, the shadows in the cave vanished. The gate closed, and there was silence all around. However, reports of new manifestations of shadows and strange disappearances began to be reported around the world. Despite all that had been done, the world was not rid of the threat of the Guardian. Only time will tell how long it will be possible to contain it, but one fact remains constant. The threat will not disappear until the entity known as the Eye gains its final freedom. Part 10: Ghosts of the Past. Several months after Eliza's disappearance and the closing of the gate, the world has slowly returned to normal. However, nothing was normal for the TRC team and all those involved with the mysterious project. Although Eliza sacrificed herself to stop the Guardian, new and terrifying events emerged from the shadows of this incident. Strange disappearances began to occur in different parts of the world, but these events were not random. Anomalous phenomena began to be recorded all over the planet. Anomalies in the magnetic field, the disappearance of people within a few kilometers of ancient archaeological sites, and reports that people were beginning to see shadows similar to those that accompanied the Guardian in the cave. These shadows are now not just frightening images, but clear signs that something far older than humanity is still watching the world. Daniel and Richard, though they tried to lead normal lives, could not shake the feeling that their battle with the Guardian was not yet over. Each of them felt the shadows following them as a mute reminder that there was no complete deliverance from this evil. Those who remained in the TRC became increasingly disturbed by what was happening. One day Daniel decided he needed to return to the cave. He knew that despite Eliza's sacrifice, the cave still retained some of the Guardian's power. He couldn't leave it unfinished. He couldn't leave this world in the state it had been in since Eliza had entered the gate. Daniel suggested that Richard and a group of old colleagues explore the cave again, but this time for a different purpose. They were to find and destroy the last remaining fragment of energy that survived in the space that had become what they called the pseudo-void. This place became the new home for the Guardian's shadow. "If we don't, all our efforts will be for naught," Daniel said, sensing that they were on the verge of something even worse. The group found themselves back in the very places where it had all started. The air here was thick, heavy, with a faint odor of ash and decay. The cave looked different, as if it had succumbed to the influence of whatever now filled it. Along the walls, one could see the strange lechan that had appeared after the gate had closed. As soon as the group went deeper into the bowels of the cave, shadows surrounded them. They looked like ghosts crawling along the walls, but they weren't just images. It was as if they were guardians, protectors of the very dark entity that now existed between the worlds. "They're trying to stop us," Richard remarked, holding his weapon at the ready. But the shadows did not attack. They were wary, but not aggressive. That was odd. Maybe they were expecting something? Maybe they realized they had come for a reason? Walking further and further, the group reached the very place where Eliza had sacrificed herself. Here, in this empty space, everything looked somehow different. A table with ancient symbols stood in the center of the cave. Around it were stones, and among them was something that looked like a window to another space. It was an echo not destroyed, but only absorbed into this world, becoming part of what was now between worlds. Daniel felt his body clench in a chill of fear. He realized that this was where the key that could set the Guardian free again at any moment was imprisoned. "Eliza didn't destroy him completely," Daniel whispered. "She only delayed it." This place they were passing through had become more than just a sealed space. It was a ritual circle enclosing the Guardian in a trap. But now that the circle had been broken, the entity had changed. It wasn't just an evil shadow. It had become something far more powerful. It had gained a new status, that of a new Guardian, that was able to absorb everything around it. Richard, standing nearby, felt a strange pull. He took a step forward, and flashes of light lit up in his eyes. It was as if he had been chosen to be the new vessel for this entity. "No," Daniel said as he saw Richard begin to lose his self-control. He knew that this was going to be resolved very quickly now. And if they didn't stop it right now, they could lose everything. At the last moment, Daniel, realizing that their powers were insufficient to destroy the new Guardian, grabbed one of the ancient artifacts they had found in the cave, a stone that emitted a strange glow. It was an artifact capable of awakening the forces of destruction. He picked it up and pointed it at Richard. "I'm sorry, Richard," he whispered. The light from the stone was so powerful that it shattered the structure of the entity that had consumed his friend. The Guardian found himself imprisoned again, but this time his existence was limited. The group returned from the cave, but the world they inhabited was never the same again. The shadows persisted, and though the Guardian was once again imprisoned, his presence was felt in every anomaly, every strange disappearance, every flash of light. "We couldn't defeat him permanently," Daniel said, looking back at the shattered world around him. "But maybe we should be prepared for him to come back. He never leaves." A story that began with a simple archaeological investigation led to a much deeper and more terrifying discovery that had no end in sight. But the questions remained, and they grew louder. Will anyone be able to stop the shadows for good? Or will they become part of the new world? Part 11, Shadow Rising. After Daniel and his team returned from the cave, they couldn't shake the feeling that the world they had returned to wasn't real. What had happened in the cave could not be without repercussions. The essence contained within the gate had not just been destroyed. It had become part of the world itself, infiltrating its fabric, its laws. The world was different, and they knew they had a new struggle ahead of them. Initially, everything seemed normal. People went back to their daily lives, and although the memory of the sacrifices, of the losses, was still fresh, it seemed that peace was gradually being restored. But soon reports of strange disappearances began to come in. People were disappearing without a trace in the most ordinary places. In towns, villages, in parks, in stores. Some of them left behind only a void, the place where they had been standing or sitting. It was as if they had become part of the world around them, dissolved into its shadows. Daniel began to notice that his own memories were beginning to fade. It was as if he was losing touch with reality. Sometimes he felt as if his life was just a stage on which he was playing a part. But in reality, it had all already happened, and he was just reliving events that were meant to be completed. "This is it," he once pronounced, standing before a mirror. "This is the influence Ford was talking about." The shadows weren't just a metaphor. They were entities that infiltrated the world, causing people to lose their identities, their selves. And these entities don't die. They live, they wait. Every day, more and more people came to TRK for help. Among them was one strange man, Jonathan Black, a research scientist who claimed to have been studying these dark phenomena for a long time. He was an old friend of Professor Ford's and had once worked with him on researching archaeological finds related to the very ancient civilizations that had created the Guardian. "You don't understand what's going on," he told Daniel when he turned to him for help. "What you thought you had destroyed has actually only just awakened. The Guardian wasn't killed. He became part of another world. But he now has the power to influence ours." Jonathan was obsessed with finding a connection between what was in the cave and the new world the Guardian had crossed over into. He claimed that with old knowledge and rituals taught to only a few, it would be possible to move into this new world again, and possibly destroy the entity forever. Daniel and his team began working with Jonathan, studying ancient manuscripts, old maps, and documents. Their goal was clear: to find a way to infiltrate the Guardian's new world and permanently seal it. But soon they began to realize that the process was becoming more and more dangerous. Each experiment, each attempt to discover new knowledge led to new anomalies in reality. They encountered manifestations they couldn't explain. For example, buildings seemed to become translucent, as if partially disappearing. People walking by disappeared without leaving a trace. "We can't understand how this world works," Daniel said, standing by the window. "It seems to consume us, our reality. Everything we do only helps it." One night, as the group was preparing for a new attempt to study ancient writings, they suddenly heard a strange noise coming from deep within the laboratory. When they approached the source of the sound, they found that an old skull, one of the artifacts found in the cave, had begun to glow, as if it had come to life. "It's not just an object," Jonathan said, shocked. It's a key. This skull is a link between worlds. It can take us to places we can't reach." Daniel felt his heart sink. This wasn't just a symbol. It was a portal. And now they stood on the threshold of another world. The group had prepared a device that would allow them to use the skull as a key to travel between worlds. They knew it could be deadly, but if they didn't go, the world would continue to be consumed by dark forces. And so, the moment the device was activated, the cave that had once been a prison for the Guardian reopened before them. Through the skull, as through a portal, they passed into a dark void where there was no light or shadow. It was a place where the laws of time and space were broken. Here was no reality as they knew it. Here there was only echo, his whisper, his presence that followed them. "You have returned," said a voice familiar to everyone. It was Elisa's voice. What they found in this world was not just a reflection of their fear. It was a place where the Guardian existed not as a physical being, but as a force affecting consciousness and reality. And Eliza, they realized, was not dead. She was part of this world, swallowed up by the shadows, but she was still human. "Eliza!" Daniel shouted, losing his strength in this world that defied explanation. But the shadows would not let them go any further. Every movement they made was met with resistance, and every step brought them closer to the inevitable collision with what had once been their friend. Now, on the verge of shattering reality, Daniel and his team had to make a choice. Could they bring Eliza back? Or was it better to leave this world in the shadows forever? And if they brought her back, what would be the price? Part 12, The Price of Return. The group stood before the abyss. The reality around them was distorted, as if the very fabric of the world itself had begun to tear. Shadows rose from dark corners, and the longer they stood there, the more their weight was felt. They knew something was about to happen. Eliza, lost in this mirror world, was their last hope and their last fear. Daniel stared intently at the portal that appeared before them, glowing with a dim blue light. He knew that if they entered it, they would not be who they were before. This world would change them and probably not bring them back. "We have to try to get her back," Daniel said, feeling his heart clench. "That's the only goal. Elise is in this world, and if we don't find her, the shadows will keep coming here." But Richard, who stood nearby, hesitated. He was prepared for danger, but realized that if they opened the gate again, it might not just be Eliza's return. "Are you sure? We can't just open the door to this world," Richard said. "We don't know what this place is, or what will happen to us when we go through it. But if we don't, this world will swallow ours," Daniel replied, his voice full of determination. "Eliza deserves to come back. We all deserve it." When they finally passed through the glowing portal, the world around them began to transform. Space, air, and light seemed to begin to break like shards of a mirror, reflecting an unspeakable void. Within this space, there was no time, no past or future, only moments joined together to form chaos. Somewhere in the distance, a figure emerged. A woman. It was Eliza. "You've come." Her voice was warm, but it had the weight of time and pain in it. "You don't realize what you've done." Daniel stepped toward her, holding out his hand. "Eliza, we've come for you," he said, his voice full of hope. "You don't have to stay here." But Eliza stopped him, her face full of sadness. "You don't understand. Can't go back. I've become part of this world. I've become part of something you can't destroy." At that moment, the shadows that lurked in the dark corners began to move. Their misty form, barely visible at first, was now tangible, dense. They began to penetrate the bodies and minds of those who had come here. "We can't bring her back," Richard whispered, feeling his own body grow heavy as if the shadows had begun to take over. "She's already part of this world. We're all doomed here." Eliza looked at them with deep understanding. "This is not the end. This is a new cycle. I can't go back, but you can stay." Her voice was almost soulless, as if her essence was dissolving into space. Suddenly, everything around her began to quiet down, and Eliza's figure began to fade away, dissolving into thin air. "No!" Daniel shouted, holding out his hand. But his voice was not heard. The group found themselves in the same place, but now everything was different. Eliza was gone, and in her place they saw a dark shadow, something huge, unimaginable, watching them. It was the Guardian, the same Guardian they had tried to destroy, But now his presence was part of their consciousness. His shadow became their reality. You freed us," a voice progressed, echoing in their minds. Shadows began to wrap around their bodies, clutching them in the void. It wasn't just a consciousness. It was a being that had penetrated their souls and now would not let them go. "I have been with you always," the voice said, and suddenly their world began to fade away. With each passing moment, they felt their minds shattering, the shadows becoming part of their very being. And finally, they realized the world they were in was not a place to return to, nor was it a place of peace. "We are lost," Daniel whispered, and his words dissolved into the void. The world became their shadows. The shadows became them. Sometime later, a group of disappearing scientists, disappearing people, disappearing destinies, became part of a new cycle. The cave where they had once found the first artifact was no longer just an empty space. It was a portal that opened a path into the void, where everything began anew. The shadows continued their endless dance, never letting go of those who dared to look into their abyss. The world, as always, was on the brink of extinction, and Eliza, and everyone else who had once been alive, had become part of something that had no end. And anyone who dared to enter that shadow became part of it. And so they remained forever,